Hey there! Today, we are about to tell you how you can use palette knives when painting with acrylics or oil. You will need Arteza palette knives, Arteza acrylic premium paint, canvas panels classic, palette knife number 7-1. Load the palette knife with some paint and then dab it on the canvas with small strokes. Follow the same principle when using a palette knife number 15. In comparison to the previous palette knife, its texture will be more pronounced and the working area will be bigger. Use a paper towel or rag to wipe down the palette knife. Then, we'll show you how to mix colors and create gradients using palette knives. We squeeze the paint of one color onto the canvas, and then we squeeze out the paint of the second color onto the palette next to it, and load it onto a palette knife number 34. When mixing, do not press hard on the palette knife. Mix the colors smoothly and gradually. The next technique we will show using the same palette knife, number 34, will be lines. To begin with, we apply a small layer of paint onto the canvas. Then press firmly on it with the edge of the palette knife and cut through the paint with a sharp movement. The second option is to load the edge of the palette knife with a thin amount of paint and then dab the edge on the canvas. When painting, it is very important to know how to properly remove excess paint. To begin with, we apply a thick layer of paint using a palette knife number 23. Then, remove the excess paint layer with smooth, gentle, and gradual movements. Next, we will show you how to create decorative volumetric strokes using a palette knife number 25. Option 1. We apply a layer of paint and then create small spots of different thicknesses and density on top of this layer. Option 2. We load the edge of the palette knife with some amount of paint and then apply small strokes immediately to the surface of the canvas. Another popular option is the pasty technique. For doing this, we use a palette knife number 1. We load some paint onto the palette knife and paint the stain in one direction, without pressing hard on the palette knife. Of course, it is worth mentioning the paint application using the edge of a palette knife. For this, we use a palette knife number 39. We load some paint on the palette knife and lightly apply it onto the canvas, slightly lifting the palette knife to form a ladder. You can use 2 or more colors to create smooth transitions between them. Using palette knife number 11, you can create beautiful elongated petals. We load some paint on the palette knife, press the palette knife to the canvas with its edge, and then take it away. The less paint on the palette knife, the drier the print will be. Besides, you can create unusual shapes using a palette knife number 7-2. Its shape allows you to make waves and cut through the paint. We load the paint onto the palette knife and without any pressure create a wave. And if you press a little on the palette knife, you will show the texture of the canvas. We like using a palette knife number 17-1 for mixing paint. It is convenient to load this palette knife with paint from the palette or directly from a can and mix it with another color. It is naturally worth mentioning the mixing of acrylics with textured paste. Thanks to this, acrylics become thicker and better hold their shape. For this, we use a palette knife number 2, since its shape can be used to create petals and flowers in one direction. The main thing is not to press hard on the palette knife. To fill in the background, you can use a palette knife number 17-2. Since this is the largest palette knife in the set, and it is perfect for working on a large area and also creating texture. Of course, these are not all the techniques that you can use when working with palette knives, but we tried to highlight the most popular ones. Now let's try to draw a turtle using all of the above. We will need Arteza palette knives, canvas panels, classic, metallic acrylic premium paint, 250 milliliter tube. Load a palette knife number 11 with 735 pearl space gray to fill in the background. The long, narrow shape helps to distribute large quantities of paint evenly across the canvas. Try to keep the palette knife parallel to the canvas, evenly distributing the pressure. Create an outline of the drawing with a brush for convenience. Using a palette knife number 7-1, create large background elements with a mix of A726 pearl turquoise, A719 pearl electric blue, and A735 pearl space gray. The shape of the palette knife allows you to scoop up a large amount of paint to create larger elements. Start moving smoothly. You can speed up the movement of your hand a little at the end. And also at the end, you can push a little harder. This will make the elements more dynamic. Using a palette knife number 21 and A726 pearl turquoise, A718 pearl sky blue, A736 pearl sapphire blue, create the diagonal color spots of medium size. The straight shape of the palette knife creates more precise and even lines. Use a palette knife number 34 to supplement the diagonal long elements of a small size, and also add small elements in short movements. Use only the extreme part of the palette knife for application. Create the shape of the turtle using a palette knife number 25. The oval and sharp shape of the palette knife allows the stroke to be more precise. It can apply both medium-sized strokes and very small strokes if working with its tip. Use the following colors: A735 pearl space gray, A734 silver, A726 pearl turquoise, and A704 Aztec gold. Use a palette knife number 1 to add some details. A very accurate tool ideal for fine detailing. We work out all the elements of the turtle: the shell, head, legs. Do it with light movements, lightly touching the surface of the canvas. Use the palette to get the color you want. Use the following colors: A701 pearl canary yellow, A703 gold, A714 pearl magenta, A729 pearl copper gold, A710 pearl pink, A712 pearl rose. Now let's create a big abstract work. For this, we need Arteza palette knives, stretched canvas classic, Arteza acrylic premium paint, metallic acrylic premium paint, 250 milliliter tube, iridescent acrylic paint, 60 milliliter bottle. To create a large abstract painting, we need a lot of acrylic paint and palette knives of various shapes, mostly large sizes. Load a large amount of paint from the palette onto a palette knife number 17-2 and apply it smoothly onto the canvas. Then complete the stroke with a sharp movement. Use the following colors: A202 scarlet red, A729 pearl copper gold, A602 emerald green, A505 Prussian blue. Mix some paint using a palette knife number 17-1 and load the resulted color onto a large palette knife number 17-2. Then transfer it to the canvas, hold the palette knife slightly tilted, and press it against the canvas. Use the following colors: A500 sky blue, A001 titanium white, A602 emerald green. Use the paint removal technique with a palette knife number 23 for small strokes. Use the following colors: A602 emerald green, A505 Prussian blue. Use a palette knife number 15 and A602 emerald green, A001 titanium white, A107 orange yellow to create strokes of different shapes over the entire surface of the canvas. Create the first technique at the bottom of the painting to balance the composition using a palette knife number 17-2. Use a palette knife number 2 and A602 emerald green and iridescent A702 shady orange to create petal strokes. With the help of a palette knife number 23, we use the line technique and cut through the paint with the palette knife to create dynamics in the composition. When working with a palette knife, try not to pinch your hand. Hold it lightly and freely so the strokes will turn out more interesting and textured. Press a palette knife only if you want to achieve the effect of paint removing. Load the A602 emerald green paint in a thick layer onto a palette knife number 17-1 and apply it onto the canvas. Then create waves using a palette knife number 7-2. All techniques can be combined, and use different palette knives to create your own unique picture. Each artist has their secrets and techniques for using palette knives. Experiment and create your own custom techniques. That's about it. We hope this video was worth watching. We wish you unlimited inspiration and great shopping at Arteza. See you soon!